sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for tuning in to the Avram Davidson Universe podcast. We have a fun guest today. His name is Henry Sussman, and he was a former professor, now friend of mine, though I still learn from him all the time. A little bit about him. He was born in Philadelphia in 1947. His childhood of classical science geekdom turned to a lifelong literary obsession in junior high. Among his early literary influences were U.S. drama of the 1930s to 1950s, Poe, Mad Magazine, and post-war sci-fi. He received his PhD in Comparative Literature in 1975 from Johns Hopkins and spent time studying and teaching in France, Germany, SUNY-Buffalo, and eventually Yale, where he developed the course German fairy tales out of his interests in critical theory, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and cybernetics. And I took this class, and this is how I know him. Like Avram, he's one of a kind and the perfect person to have on to read this episode's story, The Slovo Stove. It was originally published in 1985 in Universe 15 magazine, edited by Terry Carr. The short story takes place in 1950 in Parlos Ferry, a post-war town with Eastern European communities and characters that you will soon hear from. So enjoy.
The Slovo Stove. It would have been a bit hard for Fred Silberman to have said a completely good word for his hometown. A bunch of boors and bigots, he once described it, and life had carried him many leagues away. However, in Parlors Ferry lived Silberman's sole surviving aunt, Tanta Pesha. And of Tanta Pesha, actually a great-aunt by marriage, Silberman had only good memories. Thinking very well of himself for doing so, he paid her a visit. As reward or punishment, he was recognized on the street and almost immediately offered a very good job. Rather ruefully, he accepted, and before he quite knew what was happening, found himself almost a member of the establishment in the town where he had once felt himself almost an outcast. Okay, he had a new job and a new business. What was next? A new place to live. That was what next. He knew that if he said to his old aunt, "Tanta, I'm going to live at the hotel," Parlors Ferry had one, count them, one, she would say, "That's nice." Or if he were to say, "Tanta, I'm going to live with you," she would say, "That's nice." However, he rather thought that a roomy apartment with a view of the river was what he wanted. Fred developed a picture of it in his mind, and walking along a once long familiar street, he was scarcely surprised to see it there on the other side. The apartment house, that is. He hadn't been imagining, he had been remembering. And there was the landlady sweeping the steps just as he had last seen her 15 years ago in 1935. He crossed over. She looked up. "Mrs. Keeley, do you have an apartment to rent? My name is Fred Silberman." "Oh," she said. "Oh, you must be old Jake Silberman's grandson. I recognize the face." "A great-nephew." "I recognize the face." The rent was $75 a month. The painters would come right in, and Mrs. Keeley was very glad to have nice people living there, which was very interesting, because the last time Silberman had entered the house, Peter Toohey, who used to live upstairs, had said, "Come on over after school. I got a book with war pictures in it." Mrs. Keeley had barred the way. "You don't live here," she said. Well, times had changed. Had times changed? Something had certainly changed. The building where the new job would be lay behind where the old livery stable had been. Silberman had, of course, already seen it, but he thought he would go and see it again. The wonderful, dignified old blue-gray, thick flagstones still paved most of the sidewalks on these unfashionable streets, where modernity in the form of dirty, cracked concrete had yet to intrude. Admiring them, he heard someone call, "Freddie! Freddie!" And turning in surprise, almost at once recognized an old schoolmate. "Aren't you Freddie Silberman? I'm Wesley Brack. We still live here." They rambled on a while, mentioned where each had been in the war, catalogued some common friends. Then Wesley said, "Well, come on into the house. We're holding my father's Gromzil." Or so it sounded. "You don't know what that means, do you? See, my father passed away. It's been 3 years and 3 months. So for 3 days we have like open house. It's a Slovo and Huzuk custom, and everybody has to come in and eat and drink." So they went in. There were a lot of people in the big old-fashioned kitchen at the end of the hall. The air was filled with savory smells. The stove was covered with pots. Big pots, too. One of the older women asked something in a foreign language. Immediately, a younger man snapped, "Oh, for Christ's sake, speak United States!" He had a dark and glowering face. His name, Fred learned, was Nick, and he was a relative. "This is beef stomach stuffed with salami and hard-boiled eggs," said a woman. "Watch out. I'll pick away the string." "You gonna eat that stuff?" asked Nick. "You don't have to eat that stuff. I'll get you a hamburger from Ma's Lunch." Ma's Lunch, and its French-fried grease, and Ma with frowsy pores that tainted the ambient air. "Thanks, Nick. This is fine," said Fred. Nick shrugged, and the talk flowed on. By and by, a sudden silence fell, and there was a tiny sound from forward in the house. "Ain't you gotta feed the baby, for Christ's sake?" cried Nick. His wife struggled to rise from a chair crowded behind the table, but old Mrs. Brack, who was either Wes's mother or Wes's aunt, gestured her not to. "I will do," said she, and produced a baby bottle and a saucepan and filled the pan at the sink. There was a movement as though to take one of the heavy cookpots off the stove to make room to warm the bottle, but the dowager Mrs. Brack said a word or two, and this was not done. Perhaps only Fred noticed that she moved toward a small pile of baby clothes and diapers in a niche, as though she wanted to bring them with her, but Fred noticed also that her hands were full, so he picked them up and indicated that he would follow. "Thank you, gentlemen," she said. She gave him next an odd glance, almost as though she had a secret of which she was very well aware, and he was utterly ignorant. Odd, yes. What was it? Oh, well. In her room. "You never see a Slovo stove," Mrs. Brack said. It was not a question, it was a fact. Until that moment he had never heard of a Slovo stove. Now he gave it a glance, but it was not interesting, so he looked away. Then he looked back down at it. Resting on a piece of wood, just an ordinary piece of wood, was a sort of rack cut from a large tin can, evidently not itself brought from Europe by whichever Slovo brought the stove. On top of the rack was something black, about the length and width of a book, but thinner. Stone? Tentatively he touched a finger to it. Stone, or some stone-like composition. It felt faintly greasy. "You got to put the black one on first," Mrs. Brack said. However glossy black the old woman's hair, wrinkled was her dark face. She put on the saucepan of water and put the baby's nursing bottle in the pan. "Then the pot and water. Then you slide underneath the blue one." This, the blue one, was about the size and thickness of a magazine, and a faint pale blue. Both blue and black pieces showed fracture marks. As she slid the blue one into the rack, Mrs. Brack said, "Used to be bigger. Both. Oh, yeah. Used to could cook a whole meal. Now only room for a little saucepan. Sometimes I make tea when too tired to go in kitchen." Fred had the impression that the black piece was faintly warm. Moving his finger to the lower piece, a few empty inches were between the two, he found that definitely this was cool. And the old woman took up the awakening child and beaming down, began a series of exotic endearments. "Yes, my package. Yes, my ruby stone. Yes, my little honey bowl." A slight vapor seemed to arise from the pan, and old Mrs. Brack passed into her native language as she crooned on. Absolutely, steam was coming from the pan. Suddenly Silberman was on his knees, peering at and into the stove. Moistening a fingertip, as he had seen his mother and aunts do with hot irons 1,000,000 times, he applied it to the blue piece below. Mrs. Brack gave a snort of laughter. The blue piece was still cool. Then he wet the fingertip again and very gingerly tested the upper black piece. It was merely warm. Barely warm. The pan? Very warm. But the steam continued to rise, and the air above pan and bottle was, well, hot. Why not? She said, "You could put between some fingers." And coming over, baby pressed between one arm and bosom, placed the fingers of her free hand in between the upper and lower pieces. He followed her example. It was not hot at all in between. It was not even particularly warm. Silberman peered here and there, saw nothing more, nothing certainly to account for, well, anything. She, looking at his face, burst out laughing, removed the lower slab of stone, if it was stone, and set it down seemingly just anywhere. Then she took the bottle, shook a few drops onto her wrist, and a few drops onto Fred Silberman's wrist. Oh, it was warm, all right. And as she fed the baby, calling the grandchild her necklace, her jewel ring, her lovely little sugar bump, he was suddenly aware of two things. One, the bedroom smelled rather like Tanta Pesha's, airless and echoing faintly with a cuisine owing nothing to either franchised foods or Fanny Farmer's cookbook, even less to Ma's lunch. Two, that his heart was beating very, very fast. He began to speak, heard himself stutter. But how does it work? Work? How? Old Grandmother Brack smiled what he would come to think of as her usual faint smile. Shrugged. How do boy and girl love? How does bird fly? How water turn to snow and snow to water? How? Silberman stuttered, waved his arms and hands, was almost at once in the kitchen. So were two newcomers. He realized that he had long ago seen them 100 times, and did not know their names, and never had. "Mr. Grady and Mrs. Grady," Wesley said. Wes seemed just a bit restless. Mrs. Grady had an air of, no other words would do, faded elegance. Mr. Grady had an upswept mustache and a grizzled Van Dyke beard. He looked as though he had once been a dandy. Not precisely pointing his finger at Fred, but inclining it in Fred's general direction, Mr. Grady said, "How I remember your grandfather well. Great uncle. His horse and wagon. He bought scraps metal and old newspaper. Sometimes sold eggs." Fred remembered it well, eggs and all. Any other time he would have willingly enough discussed local history and the primeval Silbermans. Not now. Gesturing the way he had come, he said loudly, excitedly, "I never saw anything like it before. How does it work? How does it work? The... What had the old one called it? The Slovo Stove." What happened next was more than a surprise. It was an astonishment. The Grady couple burst out laughing, and so did the white-haired man in the far corner of the kitchen. He called out something in his own language, evidently a question, and even as he spoke he went on chuckling. Mr. and Mrs. Grady laughed even harder. One of the Brack family women tittered. Two of them wore embarrassed smiles. Another let her mouth fall open and her face go blank, and she looked at the ceiling. Originally of stamped tin, it had been painted and repainted so many times that the design was almost obscured. There was a hulking man sitting, stooped. Had not Fred seen him long ago with his own horse and wagon, hired likely by the day from the old livery stable, calling out, ice, ice in the summer, and coal, coal in the winter? He, the tip of his tongue protruding, lowered his head and rolled his eyes around from one person to another. Wesley looked at Silberman expressionlessly, and Nick, his dark face a smolder, absolutely glared at him. In front of all this, totally unexpected, totally mysterious, Fred felt his excitement flicker and subside. At length, Mr. Grady wiped his eyes and said something. Was it the same something? Was it a different something? Was it in Slovo? Was it in Huzuk? Was there a difference? What was the difference? Merry and cheerful, he looked at Fred, who, having understood nothing, said nothing. You don't understand our language, gentlemen? No. Your grandfather understood our language? Yes, but he didn't teach me. Actually, Uncle Jake had taught him a few words, but Silberman, on the point of remembering anyway one or two of them and quoting, decided suddenly not to. Uncle Jake had been of a rather wry and quizzical humor. Who knew if the words really meant what Uncle Jake had said they did? Wes's sister, a cousin, said, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of a wish to change the subject, perhaps for some other reason, she said, Mrs. Grady is famous for her reciting. Maybe we can persuade Mrs. Grady to recite? Mrs. Grady was persuaded. First she stood up. She put on a silly face. She put her finger in her mouth. She was a little girl. Her voice was a mimic's voice. She became, successively, hopeful, coy, foolish, lachrymose, cheerful. From the company, a few chuckles, a few titters. Then she stopped playing with her skirts, and other expressions leaving her face, the corners of her mouth turned down, and she looked around the room at everyone. Some exclamations of supposedly praise were heard, and a scattered clapping of hands. Mrs. Grady silenced all this in a moment. For a second she stood there, poker-faced, stiff. Then she began a rapid recitation in what was obviously verse. Her face was exalted, tragic, outraged, severe, lots of things. How her arms and hands moved, how she peered and scouted, how she climbed mountains, swung swords. A voice in Fred's ear said, half whispering, This is a patriotic poem. Mrs. Grady planted the flag on, so to speak, Iwo Jima. Loud cries from the others. Much applause. The patriotic poem was evidently over. The downturned mouth was now revealed to be not the mask of tragedy, but the disciplined expression of one too polite to grin or smirk at her own success. After a moment she turned to Silberman. I know that not one word did you understand, but did the ear inform you the verses were Alexandrines? He was hardly expecting this. Scarcely he knew an Alexandrine from an artichoke, and yet, not pausing to examine his memory or to analyze the reply, he said, Once I heard a recording of Sarah Bernhardt, and could have kicked himself. Surely she would feel he was taking the mickey out of her. Not at all. All phony expression gone, she made him a small curtsy. It was a perfectly done thing, in its little way a very sophisticated thing, an acknowledgment of an acceptable compliment, an exchange between equals. It made him thoughtful. Grady. So you didn't understand what this Mr. Kabaltz has asked? Gesturing to the white-haired man in the far corner. Fred shook his head. If the question dealt with iambic pentameter, he would plotz. This Mr. Kabaltz has asked the Slovo Stove, you know? Did it even get warm yet? Laughed Mr. Grady, Mrs. Grady, Mr. Kabaltz. Fred decided that ignorance was bliss. He turned his attention to the steaming bowl set before him as the people of the house dished out more food. Soup, stew, pottage. He would ask no more questions for the moment. But could he go wrong if he praised the victuals? Very good. This is very good. He had said evidently the right thing, and in the right tone. It was very good. Mr. Grady again. Your great-grandfather never sent you to the Huzuk Slovo Center to learn language? No, sir. Not there. Then where he did send you? To the Hebrew school, as they called it, to learn the prayers and the Psalms. Instantly again he saw those massive, ancient, great, thick black letters marching across the page, page after page. A fraction of a second less instantly, Mr. Grady made the not-quite-pointing gesture and declaimed, and paused, and demanded, "What is the second line, eh?" Silberman, Mr. Grady, I didn't even understand the first line. Surprise. What? Not? But it is a psalm. He pronounced the P, and he pronounced the L. Of course, in Latin, so? They didn't teach us in Latin. More surprise, then a shake of the head. Silberman thought to cite a psalm in Hebrew, reviewed the words in his mind, was overcome with doubt. Was that a line from a psalm? And not say the blessing upon seeing an elephant or something? The Hebrew teacher, a half-mad failed rabbinical student, had not been a man quick with an explanation. "Read," he used to say. "Read." More food was set out, meat in pastry crust. Then, Mr. Grady, "When you will be here tomorrow, perhaps I shall bring my violin," he pronounced it violin, "and play something." That would be nice, Fred noncommittally, and turning again to the food of the memorial feast. "Delicious," said Fred. "Is it warm yet?" Mr. Grady. "Hoo, hoo, hoo." Mr. Grady, Mrs. Grady, Mr. Kabaltz. People entered, talked, ate, left. Someone, "You're old Jake Silberman's grandson?" "Great-nephew." By and by, Fred looked up. Mr. Kabaltz and the Gradys were gone. For a moment he heard them just outside the door, laughing, footfalls. The gate closed. Nobody seemed left but family members. And Fred. Silence. Someone said, "Well, there go the Zonks." Someone else, "Don't call them that. Call them Huzuks." Wesley suddenly leaped up, almost toppling his chair, began to bang his head against the wall. "I can take chinks!" Bang. "I can take Japs!" Bang. "I can take wasps, Hebes, and mix!" Bang, bang, bang. "Wesley, Wasili, I can take Spics and Blacks!" Bang, bang. "I cannot take Zunks!" Bang. Abruptly he sat down and held his head. In Fred's mind, question. So, what's a Zunk? Answer, a deprecated Huzuk. Wes began again. "They can talk Latin. We can hardly grunt. They recite poems. We can barely tell a dirty joke. They have violinists. We are lucky if we got fiddlers. Why did God punish us poor Slovo Slavs by putting us in the same country with them over there in Europe? Why are we still respectful to them over here in America? Why? Somebody please tell me why." A sister, or maybe a sister-in-law, said somewhat slowly, "Well, they are better educated." This set Wes off again. "In their dialect, they had books, magazines, newspapers. All we had was the catechism and the missal in ours. We had a newspaper. Didn't Papa's brother used to send it to us sometimes? Wesley brushed the invisible ethnic newspaper aside. The Patriotsk came out once a month. One sheet of paper printed on 4 pages. What was in it? The new laws, the price of pigs, some obituaries, no births, and the saints' days in both church calendars. That's all. Finish. The Patriotsk. Evidently, the invisible newspaper had climbed on the table again, for Wesley swept it off again, and then he trampled on it, heavily. "Hey, look at the time. I gotta be going. I sure want to thank you for that delicious—" "We are giving you some to take with you home," said an aunt. Or was it a niece? It's the custom. And you liked? Oh, sure. But my new apartment isn't ready yet, and my aunt is strictly kosher. They didn't say anything ecumenical. Neither did they tell him that the law of Moses was dead and reprobate. They began to put fruit into a paper bag, a large paper bag. But Wes, taking head from hand, was not finished yet. Why? Why? Will someone tell me why? Someone, surely a sister, too straight-faced to be serious, said, "They are so beautiful. They ride red horses." Wes almost screamed. When had she ever seen a huzuk on a horse? When had she ever seen a red horse? Nick's wife told Silberman that it was a saying, a proverb. Anyway, some people say it wasn't the horse that was red, but, the things on the horse. What the horse, wore. Nick, who had been reading the funny papers with a very unfunny expression, now fired up. "Who gave a damn?" he demanded. "Quit talking about all them old European things," he demanded. Fred announced his thanks for the fruit. Wes asked Nick if he wasn't interested in his rich old world heritage. Nick, upon whom subtlety was wasted, shouted that no, he wasn't. Wes ceased being subtle and shouted back. Fred Silberman said that he really had to be going and started out. Someone came out into the hall and walked along with him, old Mrs. Brack, being very polite, he thought. A dim light was on in her room. She stopped. He paused to say good night. The look she now gave him, had she been 40 years younger, would have been an invitation which she knew could not be what she now meant. What was it she now meant? "You want to come in," she said. "You want to see how it works." She moved inside the room. Silberman followed, beginning to breathe heavily, beginning to feel the earlier excitement. He had forgotten. How could he have forgotten? "First, you put on the black piece, up on here." The book-sized slab slid into its place on the rack. The infant sighed in sleep. "Yes, my rope of pearls," she said softly. "Next, you put on the saucepan with the water in it. Now I make just a bowl of tea for me. And so, next, you put in the blue piece, about the size of a magazine, down there. See? This is what we call the Slovo Stove. And now it gets warm." What had the old huzuks, those quasi-countrymen of the old Slovos, what had they meant, "Is it even warm yet?" Silberman forgot the question as he watched the vapors rise, felt the air warm above, felt the unwarmed space between the two pieces, the thicker fragment of black stone, if it was stone, and the thin fragment of pale blue, saw astonishingly soon the size of crabs' eyes, the tiny bubbles form, and finally the rolling boil. He was still dazed when she made the tea. He hadn't remembered setting down the bag of fruit, but now he picked it up, said a soft thank you and good night, and left the house. He could hear them still shouting in the kitchen. "That's nice," said Tanta Pesha when he gave her the fruit. "Tanta, what is it with the huzuks and the Slovos?" Out came the bananas. "The huzuks." She washed the bananas, dried them with a paper towel, dropped it in the garbage. "The huzuks, they are all right." Out came the oranges. "Well, what about the Slovos?" She washed the oranges. "The Slovos?" She dried the oranges with a paper towel, dropped it in the garbage. "The Slovos, they are very clean. You could eat off their floors. On Saturday night they get drunk." And he waited for more. But no more came. Tanta Pesha was washing the apples. This done, she was overcome by a scruple. "Used to," she said. "Now, I don't know. Since I moved away." How long had she and Uncle Jake lived near the huzuks and Slovos neighborhood? She began to dry the apples with a paper towel. How long? 40 years, she said. 40 years, 42? Let it be 40. Had she ever heard of the Slovo Stove? No, she never had. Well, how come they don't like each other? Tanta Pesha looked at him a moment. "They don't?" she said. She dropped the paper towel in the garbage. Then she put the fruit into a very large bowl and, standing back, looked at it. "That's nice," she said. The next morning, early, Silberman drove down to the city and made arrangements to be moved, and drove back to the ferry. He went to take a look at his apartment to be. Lo, the painters were actually painting in it. Mrs. Keeley stopped sweeping to assure him that everything would be ready in a day or two. "Well, a couple of days," she amended. "You won't be sorry. This has always been a very nice block, more than I can say for some parts of town. The element that's moving in nowadays. I give you a very nice icebox, Mr. Silberman." "Say, thanks, Mrs. Keeley. I really appreciate that. Say, Mrs. Keeley, what's the difference between the Huzuks and the Slovos?" Mrs. Keeley shrugged and pursed her lips. "Well, they mostly don't live right around here. Mostly they live down around, Tompkins, Jerry, DeWitt, mostly around there." She adjusted her hairnet. "But is there a difference between them? I mean, there's got to be. Some are called Huzuks and some are called Slovos. So there must be a—" Mrs. Keeley said, well, frankly, she never took no interest in the matter. "Monsignor up at St. Carol's, that big church on the hill, he used to be a Huzuk, rest his soul, what they tell me. Now your Bosnians, as they call them, they mostly live around on Greenville Street, Ashby, St. Lo. The Lemkos, whatever the hell they are, excuse my French, you find them mostly in them little streets along by the creek, Ivy, Sumac, Willow, Lily, Rose. Well, used to. Nowadays people are moving around, she said rather fretfully. And I wish they wouldn't. I wish they would stay put. So as to them people that you asked me about, Hozoks and Slobos, mostly you find them down around on Tompkins, Jerry, DeWitt, them streets there. What time is it? Is my program coming on?" She went into her apartment and closed the door behind her. A second later, he heard a radio increased in volume. He wandered out into the street. The streets. The streets had certainly been wide enough when Uncle Jake's had not been almost the only horse and wagon plying for trade along them. But that had been a long time ago. The streets had been full of children then. Oh, what a merry, cheerful sight, you think so? To Fred Silberman, as a small child, this had been Indian country, full of hostiles. Oh, well. Then, during the Depression, there had been a considerable depopulation. Stores had emptied and stayed empty, and one of the public schools, number 7, had even closed. However, in the year or two before the war, several empty factories had been reopened as defense plants, and many new faces had appeared on the streets. Southern blacks, island tans, mountain whites. Then Fred had gone off into the army and, really, had only now come back. Coming back out of his reverie, he found himself in a time warp. Gone were the 4-story tenements, block after block of them. He was in a neighborhood of wooden houses, old wooden houses, old wooden fences, old wooden trees. Right across the street was a store building, a sagging rectangle of boards. Seemingly just as he remembered it, even to the raised letters on the glass storefront. Sal-da-ta. Untouched by any recent paint was a sign, Matt Grady Meats Groceries. He went in, knowing that a bell would tinkle, so of course one did. The showcase on one side was large enough to show lots and lots of meats. What it showed now were some scrawny pieces of pig, a hunk of head cheese, a hunk of Swiss cheese, a tray of lilac-colored sausages, and, in a puddle of congealing blood, half of a head of something, cut longitudinally and looking incredibly anatomical. The store seemed vast, and was vastly empty. The smell proclaimed that Coolidge was president. The floor was splintery and clean. Looking up from something on the counter, Mr. Grady gazed with absolute amazement. Was he merely amazed that Fred Silberman was coming into his store? That someone who looked like Fred Silberman was coming into his store? Or simply that anyone, was coming into his store? Then he smiled, dipped his head to one side. They shook hands. Fred asked for some small item. Grady shrugged one shoulder. Fred asked for a different small item. Another shrug. Fred tried to think of some other small item, opened his mouth to name something, said, and named nothing. Grady laughed. A finger brushed his long mustaches. Right, left. Rice, he asked. Sugar? Potatoes? It was Silberman's turn to laugh. The elder man joined in. A cut of head cheese was his next suggestion. And a cut of Swiss, a sliced roll, I give mustard for nothing. Somehow they wound up sharing the sandwich. Fred, observing an opened book on a newspaper there atop the counter, asked Mr. Grady what he was reading. The book was turned around, but it was Greek to Fred. Schiller, said the grocer, turning pages. Heine, you can read in the original? He widened his eyes at Fred's headshake. What great pleasure you are missing. So, but Lermontov? Pushkin? What? Nope. A look of mild surprise and mild reproof. A sigh. So, no wonder you have Slovo friends. The front of his very clean, very threadbare apron moved in merriment. This was it, the opening. Mr. Grady. Mr. Grady bowed slightly. His horse, his carriage were at Fred Silberman's disposal. Mr. Grady, what is it with you people, your people, and the Slovo people? Could you tell me that? I would like to know. I would really like to know. Mr. Grady stroked his smile, mustachios, Van Dyke and all. He looked, Silberman suddenly thought, he would have looked much like the Kaiser, if the Kaiser had ever looked much like having a sense of humor. Well, I shall tell you. In our old kingdom, there back in Europe, in one province lived mainly Huzuk only. In one province lived mainly Slovo only. In our own province lived we both. Now, how shall I explain? To say that the Slovo were our serfs, not exact. To say they were our tenants, our servants, but, well, our thralls. You see, the kings, they were of foreign origin, a dynasty. We were their feudalists, we Huzuk, and the Slovo, they were our feudalists. His smile indicated not so much satisfaction with the subordinate position of the Slovo as satisfaction with his explanation. And as Silberman stood leaning against the counter digesting this, the old grocer added to it, the Slovo were not, bad people. They were simple, very simple people. They had come into Europe long ago, following behind the Magyar and the Avar, had been granted permission to settle down in empty land belonging to the Huzuk, had become Christianized, civilized, gave up their old language, adopted the language of the Huzuk, which they spoke badly, very badly. Here, with many chuckles, Grady gave examples of the comical Slovo dialect, of which exemplar Fred, of course, understood nothing whatsoever. He did take advantage of the old man's laughing himself into a coughing fit and then into smiling silence. What about their stove, Mr. Grady? What's with the Slovo stove? What is it? What is it, and how does it work? And here Mr. Grady threw back his head and laughed and laughed and coughed and coughed and laughed and coughed and laughed. It took quite a while for him to recover, and after he had been slapped on the back and had sipped a glass of water and sucked a lifesaver and assured Fred with many mimes and gestures that he was now all right, Grady spoke in a weakened voice, incomprehensibly, then rather more clearly, though very husky. "Did it get warm yet?" he asked. Silberman jumped away from the counter. "But what do you mean by that? You said it last night, and so did Mr. What's-his-name with the thick white hair, and you both laughed and laughed then." The woman in the story, the Slovo woman in the story, the famous story anecdote, you know. But finally Fred got his point across that no, he did not know. Grady was amused at this. At this next, Grady was incredulous, and finally persuaded that indeed, famous or never so famous, the story anecdote was absolutely unknown to F. Silberman. "Your great-grandfather did not ever told you? No? No?" Grady was absolutely delighted. God knows when he at last had an absolutely fresh audience. A Slovo woman had newly emigrated to the United States, came to stay with relatives. By and by, someone asked that a pot of water be put on for tea. "I will do it," said the greenhorn woman. Did she know how to do it? Of course, of course. What did they think? Of course she knew how. Shouldn't someone go and show her? Nonsense, not necessary. Off she went from the front room into the kitchen to put the water on for the tea. So they talked, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and still no call from the kitchen. Had she gone out the back door? So someone went in to see. They found her standing by the stove and looking at it. Grady indicated her perplexed look. "Was the water hot yet?" Here Grady indicated that the great punchline was coming. Here Grady put hands on hips and an expression of annoyance and bewilderment on face. "Was the water hot yet? Hot? Hot? It didn't even get warm." Neither did Silberman. What the hell? But the story anecdote was not over. The punchline was followed by an explanation. A, the Slovo greenhorn woman knew nothing about a gas range. B, the Slovo greenhorn woman assumed that the gas range was simply a Slovo stove, American style. C, so she, seeing that the grate, which to her was of course the black part, seeing this already in place, she put water in the pot and set it on top. D, leaning against the gas stove, there happened to be the grease tray, usually placed, of course, underneath the burners to catch spatters and drips. It had just been cleaned. That was why it was where it was. It was enameled and a pale blue. E, so assuming that this was the blue part, she had slid it into place underneath the burners. F, had not turned on the gas. G, had not struck a match. H, had just waited for this American gas stove to behave like a Slovo stove. And here came the question and answer together again, as inexorable as Greek tragedy, and by now almost as familiar as Weber and Fields or Abbott and Costello. "Was the water hot yet? Hot? Hot? It didn't even get warm." This was evidently, and by now Fred had had lots of evidence, the hottest item there had ever been in Huzuk humor in the history of the world. Joe Miller, Baron Munchausen, Charlie Chaplin, step way back. Get ready for something really funny. The anecdote story of the greenhorn who thought that by sliding the grease tray underneath the gas burners and by doing nothing else, she could produce heat. Hacha! Yakety-bopcha! Why, this venerable race joke, certainly worth a chuckle when fresh and crisp, still guffawed its way down the corridors of time, required more consideration than Fred was then prepared to give. But it was a lot easier to understand why the Slovos who had been listening to it for how long? 40 years, 80 years? Were beginning to get kind of restless. And how does it work, Mr. Grady? I mean, scientifically. The one-shoulder shrug. Who knows, my dear young gentleman? Consider the electrical properties of the amber, a great curiosity of the former age, but today merely we flick a switch. The local public library was not changed much since Andrew Carnegie had helped endow it. There was nothing in the catalog under either Huzuk, Slovo, or Stove which provided even faint enlightenment. The encyclopedia ran to information about the former dynasty and its innumerable dull rulers. Also, the Huzukia areas have become moderately industrialized, and the interests of the Slovoia areas remain largely agrarian, and exports include duck down, hog bristles, coarse grades of goat hair and wool. Goody. In the reference room, the little librarian with the big eyeglasses listened to his request, said in her old-time, professionally hush-hush voice, "I think there's a pamphlet." And there certainly was a pamphlet. It was bound in tightly with a bunch of other pamphlets on a bunch of other subjects. The nameless author-publisher, published by the author, had disguised the fact of not having much to say by saying it in rather large type. Leaning on the volume with both hands to keep it open, Silberman learned that the Slovoi themselves no longer admit to know just where was or even approximately their ancestral old home or old place near the big water. The latter has been suggested for Caspian Sea or Aral Sea, even fantastically has been suggested Lake Baikal. In Parler's Ferry are found Huzuki in many middle-class professional commercial role, and has been correctly suggested Slovoi fulfill labor tasks with commendable toil and honesty. There was nothing about stoves, and Fred felt that unless he wanted eventually to sell photographs of his wrists to Charles Atlas, he might as well let go of the bound volume of pamphlets. He did, and it closed like a bear trap. The pamphlet probably contained the text of a paper done for a pre-World War I class in night school, the author of which, intoxicated by getting a fairly good grade, had rushed it off to a job printer. It was suggested in Fred's mind that he was probably a huzuk. Back at Fred's new apartment to be, lo, the painters were no longer painting. The painters were no longer, in fact, there, and neither was the painting finished. Only in the middle of the drainboard of the kitchen sink sat a white bread and sardine sandwich with a single symmetrical bite missing out of it. Another unsolved mystery of the sea. Or had it come there by a fortuitous concourse of the atoms? Why not? Down went Fred and rang Mrs. Keeley's bell. By and by the door opened a crack long enough to transmit heavy breathing and the odor of gin and onions. Almost at once the door closed shut again, and by the volume of the radio went up. Mrs. Keeley was not one of your picky listeners out there in Radioland who require very fine tuning, and Silberman was unable to say if she was listening to an old recording of the Tasty Yeast Jesters, or maybe one of a love song by President Harding. He went away. Akot Shea Brak, an aunt said as he came in, "I saved you some fruit stew." And also, Wes poured him something powerful-looking. Evidently, the conventicle potlatch was still going on, with Fred's presence still acceptable. Although a newspaper was lowered. Behind it was Nick. "Don't make the old lady show you that GD stove no more," he said. "She's all wore out." Fred said easily, "Okay, Nick." "Who else has got one?" he asked the world at large. There was a thinking pause. Wes said, "No one that he knew of." "It's the last of the Mohicans," Wes said. Nick slapped down the paper. "She better get rid of it. You hear me? I'm going to smash it up. I'm going to throw it off of the bridge. I don't want to ever hear about it. No wonder they make fun of us all the time." No one said a word, so Nick said a word, a short and blunt one, and then, as though shocked himself, slammed out of the room. In a moment, a car drove rapidly away. Wes was expressionless and seemingly emotionless. Fred sampled the fruit stew. Was it the same as stewed fruit? No, it wasn't. Good, though. As soon as his spoon scraped the bottom, a bowl of something else was set down beside him, and a plate of something else. "Here is beaten up bean soup with buttermilk and vinegar. This is lamb fritters with fresh dill." Golly, they sounded odd. Golly, they were good. In a corner across the room, an old man and an old woman discordantly sung religious texts from, shared between them, an old wide book in old wide huzuk or something of the sort. "That's supposed to benefit the soul of the late deceased," said a very young man with a very large and shiny face, in a tentatively contentious tone. "College boy," said Wes. Could it hurt? Fred Silberman put down his spoon. Eating fritters with a spoon? Sure, why not? Hurts you? Listen, where was the old home place by the big water? He asked. The college boy instantly answered, Gitchy Gumi. Wes said, with a shrug of his own, far heavier than Matt Grady's, Who the hell knows? Whoever knew? You think they had maps in those days? I suppose that one year the crops failed and there was no nourishment in the goat turds, so they all hit the road, west. And once they crossed a couple mountains and a couple of rivers, not only didn't they know where they were, they didn't even know where they'd been. Fred said, Listen, Nick isn't here. The Huzuks aren't here. Nobody is here but us chickens. Cut. God should strike me dead if I laugh at you. Where did the stoves come from? The Slovo stoves? Who the hell knows? Well, did they have them when they left wherever it was, Lake Ontario or the Yellow Sea? Did they? Wes just sighed. But his probably sister took to answering the question and the further questions, and when she didn't know, asked her elders and translated the answers. According to old stories, yes, they did have the stoves before they left the old place. The black parts, they came from the mountain, and the blue parts, they came from the big water. From the inside of the mountain, what mountain? Nobody knows what mountain, and from the bottom of the big water. How did they get the idea? Well, Father Joachim said that the angels gave it to them. Father Joachim said. Now, that's not what the old people used to say. What did the old people used to say? The old people used to say it was the little black and white gods, but Father Joachim, he thought people would think that meant like devils or something, so he changed it and, well, there aren't any little black and white gods, for God's sake. Oh, you're so smart, you think you... Maybe they were from outer space, said Silberman, to his own surprise as much as anyone else's. Silence the most profound. Then the college boy, probably either a nephew or a cousin, said slowly, Maybe they were. Another silence. Then they were all off again. The trouble all began with Count Kazmar. Count Kazmar had like a monopoly on all the firewood from the forest. The king gave it to him. Yes, but the king didn't just give it to him. He had to pay the king. Okay, so he had to pay the king. So anybody wanted firewood, they had to pay Count Kazmar. Then he got sore because the Slovo people weren't buying enough firewood, see, because he still had to pay the king. Which king? Who the hell knows which king? Who the hell cares? None of them were any damn good anyway. What, old King Joseph wasn't any good, the one who let Yashta Yushta out of the dungeon? Listen, will you forget about old King Joseph and get on with the story? So Count Kazmar sent out all the blacksmiths to go from house to house with their great big sledgehammers to smash up all the Slovo stoves, to force the Slovos to buy more firewood, and... What? Yeah, that's how Grandma's stove is, like, broken. They all got, like, broken. Of course you could still use them, but dumb Count Kazmar, he didn't know that. So, what finally happened? Everybody had to pay a firewood tax, irregardless of how much they used or not. So a lot of the Slovo people, they figured you got to pay for it anyway, so might as well use it. See? A lot of them figure you got to pay for it anyway, so you might as well use it. And so a lot of them quit using their Slovo stoves, you see? That's your superior Huzuk civilization for you, Wes said. Just then the deacon and deaconess in the corner, or whatever they were, lifted their cracked old voices and finished their chant, and everybody said something loudly, and they all stamped their feet. Here, Fred, said Wes, have some more. Have another glass of mulberry beer. And promptly an aunt set 2 more bowls down in front of Fred. In this one is chopped spleen stew with crack buckwheats. And in other one is cow snout cooked under onions. Wait, I give you pepper. Eventually, Silberman got moved into his new apartment, and eventually Silberman got moved into his new job. His new job required, among many other things, a trip to the die makers, a trip to the printers, a trip to the suppliers. How convenient that all 3 were located in a new or newish commercial and industrial complex way out on the outskirts of. As he drove, by and by, such landmarks as an aqueduct, a cemetery, an old brick foundry, reminded him that more or less where the commercial and industrial complex now was where old Applebaum used to be. Low, it seemed, still was. Shabby, but still reading M. Applebaum Cash and Carry Wholesale Groceries. The complicated commerces and industries perhaps didn't like shabby old Applebaums holding out in their midst. Tough. Let 'em go back where they came from. Afterwards, business finished elsewhere. Thither. Freddie! Hello! Hello, Mr. Applebaum. How are you? How should I be? Every week seems like another family grocery bites the dust. No. I own a little swamp in Florida, and maybe I will close up the geschäft and go live on a houseboat with hot and cold running crocodiles. Here comes an old customer with his $10 worth of business if we are both lucky. Matt Grady. Sure enough. Beat him to the punch. Hey, Mr. Grady, did it get hot yet? Grady laughed and laughed, and then gave the counter word. It didn't even get warm. He gestured to another man. This is Petey Plazek. He is half-breed. Hey, Petey, did it get hot yet? Mosek, this to old Applebaum. A little sugar I need. A little semolina I need. A little cake flour. Licorice candy. Marshmallow crackers. M. Applebaum said he could give him a goodbye on crackers today. They went inside together. Petey Plazek, a worn-looking man in a worn-looking lumber jacket, came right to the point. If you're driving by the bus depot, could you give me a ride? Sure, get in. Off they went. Silverman's glance observed no Iroquois cheekbones. Excuse me, but what did he mean, a half-breed? No offense. Nah. Half Huzuk, half Slovo. A touch of excitement. Well, Mr. Plazek, Petey, just Petey. Well, Petey, how many people have one of those old Slovo stoves anymore? Nobody. Them stoves are all a thing of the past nowadays. Watch out for that truck. How come, Petey? How come they are? Petey rubbed his nose, sighed very deeply. Well, you know, some greenhorn would come to America. As we used to say, he had 6 goats and he sold 5 to get the steamship ticket, and he gave one to the priest to pray for a good journey. I'm talking about a Slovo now. Huzuk, that's another thing altogether. So the poor Slovo was wearing high boots with his pants tucked in them, and a shirt smock and a sheepskin coat and a fur hat. This was before Ellis Island. Castle Garden in those days. He didn't have a steamer trunk. He didn't have a grip. He only had a sort of knapsack. So what was in it? A clean smock shirt and some clean foot rags because they didn't use socks, and a little iron pot and some hardtack type bread, and those 2 stove parts, the black part and the blue part. The blue part, right. Watch out for that Chevy. Well, he'd get a job doing the lowest paid, dirtiest work, and he'd rent a shack that subsequently you wouldn't dast keep a dog in it. You understand what I'm telling you, young fella? Lights? He had no lights. He didn't even have no lamp. Just a tin can with some pork fat and a piece of rag for a wick. And he'd pick up an old brick here and an old brick there and set up his Slovo stove and cook buckwheat in his little iron pot, and he'd sleep on the floor in his sheepskin coat. But by and by, things would get better. This was America, the land of opportunity. So as soon as he started making a little money, he brought his wife over, and they moved into a room, a real room, and he'd buy a coal oil lamp and a pair of shoes for each of them. But people would still laugh at him. Particularly the Zunks would still be laughing at him because of still using the Slovo stove, you see? So by and by, they'd buy a wood stove or a coal stove, and they'd get the gas light turned on, and they'd even remember not to blow it out. Yes, but Petey, the wood and coal cost money, and the Slovo stove was free, so... Petey sighed again. Well, to tell you the truth, it could cook, sure. Didn't give out much heat otherwise. Boil up a lot of water, place it gets steamy. Fred Silberman cried, Steam heat! Steam heat! Petey looked startled, then for the first time interested. Then the interest ebbed away. He sighed. None of them people were plumbers. They never thought of nothing like that, and neither did anybody else. The Slovo Stove would have come to mean poverty, see? It come to mean ridicule. And so as soon as they quit being dirt poor, well, that was that. Fred asked eagerly, but aren't there still a lot of them in the attics? Well, some of them in the cellars? Petey's breath hissed. Where you going? You going to the bus depot, you should have turned left. Oh, circling the block. Nah, they just throw 'em away. Watch out for that van. The new job and its new responsibilities occupied and preoccupied most of Silberman's time. But one afternoon, as he was checking an invoice with the heating contractor fitting up the plant, lo, the old matter came abruptly to his mind. Sudden thought, said Mr. McMurtry. Yeah. You ever hear of a Slovo Stove? Promptly, no. Should I have? Suppose Fred were to tell him. What then? Luddite activity on the part of McMurtry. Let me ask you a make-believe question, Mac. Fire when ready. So, haltingly, ignorantly, Fred, naming no names, no ethnic groups, described matters as well as he could, winding up. So, could you think, Mac, of any scientific explanation as to how such a thing could or might maybe work? At all? Mac's brow furrowed, rolling the hairs of his conjoined eyebrows. A very odd effect. Well, obviously, the liquid in the container acts as a sort of non-contiguous catalyst, and this amplifies the vortex of the force field created by the juxtaposition of the pismire and the placebo. Well, of course, McMurtry did not say that, but that was what it sounded like to Silberman, and so McMurtry might just as well have said it. McMurtry said one last word or two. If these things weren't make-believe, it would be interesting to examine them. Even a couple of little pieces might do. What can be analyzed could maybe be duplicated. Once things got going well at work, Fred thought he would go and ask old Mrs. Brack. Go and ask old Mrs. Brack what? Would she let the sole extant Slovo Stove be examined by an expert, be looked at in a lab, be scraped to provide samples for electronic microscopic analysis? He might suggest that. If she didn't trust him, it might be done through a Brack family trust or something to be set up for that purpose. Via Wes and, say, Nick. Sure, he might. But he waited too long. Silberman, of course, knew nothing. How could he have known? The people of the house had just learned themselves. All he knew, arriving early one night, was that as he came up to the house, a tumult began within. Lots of people were yelling. And as he came into the Brack kitchen, Nick was yelling alone. "We're Americans, ain't we?" he yelled. "So let's live like Americans. Bad enough so the Huzuks make fun of us. I'm tired of all them old country ways. What next? What else? For hats, boots, a goat in the yard?" He addressed his wife. 100 times I told your old lady, throw it away, throw the damn thing away. I am tired they making fun of us, Mama, you hear? But she didn't. So I did. He stopped, breathing hard. That's all. A sick feeling crept into Silberman's chest. Where did you throw it? Where? It wasn't yours. His wife. Nick pressed his lips together. His wife clapped her hand to her head. He always used to say, I'll throw it off the bridge. I'll throw it off the bridge. That's where. Oh, you hoodlum. For a moment his eyes blazed at her. Then he shrugged, lit a cigarette, and began to smoke with an air of elaborately immense unconcern. Old Mrs. Brack sat with her faint smile a moment more. Then she began to speak in her native language. Her voice fell into a chant. Then her voice broke. Then she lifted her apron to her eyes. She says all she had to remind her of the old home country. All she wanted to do was sometimes warm the baby's bottle or sometimes make herself a bowl of tea in her own room if she was tired. She's an old lady, and she worked hard, and she never wanted to bother nobody. Nick threw his cigarette with force onto the linoleum, and heedless of shrieks, stamped on it heavily. Then he was suddenly calm. All right, listen. Tomorrow I'll buy you a little electric stove, what do they call it? A hot plate. Tomorrow, for your own room, I'll buy you a hot plate, okay? The effect was great. Nick had never been known, voluntarily, to buy anything for anyone. Old Mrs. Brack exclaimed in English, "You will?" He gave a solemn nod. "I swear to God." He crossed his heart. "Tomorrow. The best money can buy. Mama can come with me," he added. His wife kissed him. His older brother-in-law patted him on the back. The old woman began to smile again. Silberman felt his heart pounding at twice its regular rate. He dared say nothing. Then, by and by, Nick strolling out into the yard and lighting up another cigarette, he strolled out after him. "Nick?" "Yeah?" "I'm going to ask you something. Don't get mad." "Go ahead." "You really threw the stove parts off the bridge?" "Yeah, well, the pieces." "Pieces?" Nick yawned, nodded. "I took the damn thing to the shop, where I work, you know." Fred knew. "And I run 'em through the crusher. What was left, I put 'em in a bag. I threw it off of the bridge." He wasn't angry or regretful. He let fall his cigarette, stomped it, went back into the house. Fred heard him working the television. The shop. Sneaky as could be, Fred lurked and skulked and peeked. The light was on. The door was open. Had Nick left them so? No matter. Surely some crumbles of blue or black would be left, and he would zip in, scoop them off the floor by the crusher, and... A long shadow oozed across the floor, the janitor humping his broom. A real old-time Slovo, immense mustache and all, of the real old-time Slovo sort. In a minute he was gone. Fred zipped all right, but he didn't scoop. There was nothing to scoop. No crumbles. There wasn't even dust. Tanta Pesha was not physically present, but her voice sounded in her great-nephew's ears. "The Slovos, they are very clean. You could eat off their floors." He drove his car up and down the silent streets, shouted aloud, "I don't believe it! The greatest discovery in thermodynamics since the discovery of fire, and it's gone. It's gone. It can't be gone. It can't be." In the days that followed, in the weeks and months, he knocked on doors, he advertised, he offered rewards, pleaded, begged. That incredible discovery, mysteriously having come to Earth, who knew how, and who knew how many thousands of years ago, or how many thousands of miles away. It was gone. Fred threw himself into his work, developed locally an active social life, womanized, thought of marriage, changed. Other things changed, too. Wes Brack abruptly moved to Idaho. Why Idaho, of all places? Because, he said, it was as far away from the Huzuks as he could get and still wear shoes. Oh. And the rest of the Brack family, plus Nick, led by Nick, almost as suddenly moved to Brownsville, Texas. Why Brownsville, Texas? To get away from the cold. Others might move to Florida, California, Arizona to get away from the cold. The rest of the Brack family, plus Nick, moved to Brownsville, Texas to get away from the cold. It seemed somehow a very Slovo sort of thing to do. They were ripping up Statesman Street again, and Fred had to detour. Had to drive along Tompkins, Jerry, and DeWitt streets. For one reason or another, he did drive along there. My, the neighborhood had changed. The new neighbors glanced at him with unneighborly glances. There was Gradi's store, but one whole once-glass pane was missing, boarded up. He stopped, went in. There was Mr. Gradi, part of his face bandaged, the other part bruised and discolored. His violin was in his hand. He nodded his jaunty nod. Would you enjoy to hear a little Paganini? He asked. Began to play. Silberman felt that he was present at almost the last scene of a very antic drama. Old Matt Grady, with his wife's Alexandrines, his violin, Heine, Schiller, Lermontov, Pushkin, Paganini, and the Latin psalms. How long could he last? If he didn't starve to death in his almost empty store, how long before they killed him? The old man let the violin fall to his side. For an odd, long moment, he gazed at Silberman with a very level gaze. Then a smile twitched onto his swollen, battered face. He shrugged one shoulder. He began to laugh. It didn't even get warm, he chuckled.
Professor, what do you think?
Oh, what a great story. What a great world it absorbs us into. Is that your feeling too?
Oh, yeah. And I also wanted to say this, that I think it was, I read it a few times as well. And every time I read it, I'm happier and happier that I chose it for you specifically. And in general, I'm excited. I'm very happy to share Davidson's work with you, because I think that he is a combination of very playful, but and at the same time extremely astute, and you can't really be lazy reading him, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Just like you can't really be lazy playing with a child. It's all encompassing. You need to really be there, all senses on. And I thought you would really appreciate the sort of lighthearted, playful, magical surrealism. I forget the phrase that you used in your original email to me about something realism. Fantastic realism, was that it?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you would appreciate that before I even knew that phrase. So I was really excited to share this with you.
Well, I'm so glad you did. And of course, as ever, you're spot on. It's a kind of writing that keeps you on your toes, because its basic style is the kind of post-war realism that was just perfect for science fiction as it would come out, in pulp books. Like what I have here is a first edition of Robert Heinlein's The Man Who Sold the Moon. And if you just look at the cover, you see the world that Avram Davidson was writing in. And it was a world that wasn't too snooty to write very concretely about a real world. And the town in our story is called Parlor's Ferry, which is so interesting. It has the word parlor with a U in it, which is really kind of very kind of upscale, but then it is a kind of dingy industrial town, the perfect place for the dynamics of the old world to play themselves out.
Good catch. I didn't even catch that. The U. Yeah, Parlor's Ferry. I counted, I went back to the beginning earlier today. And it's so funny because now the first line is striking me, where it was extremely spot on from the very beginning, where the first line is, "It would have been a little hard for Fred Silberman to have said a completely good word for his hometown, quote, a bunch of bores and bigots, quote, as he once described it." And he was spot on, because then the rest of the story is kind of about bigotry in a way.
That's right.
It's just a funny full circle sort of thing.
But it's it's a world where everything is on the table, And the distinction, I don't want to go too far ahead, and you'll keep me on track, but the big sociological or ethnic strife in the story is between a group of people called the Slovos and a group of people called the Husiks, and they hail from Czechoslovakia, right? The story is very much coded toward the ethnic outcropping in post-war USA of Czechoslovakia, and within that configuration, most of the characters that we see in the story and meet, and they're all so vivid and wonderful, are Slovos. They are Slovakians, and in relationship to the Czechs, they are the peasants, right? They are the earthy people, right? And their houses are so spick and span, you can eat off the floor, but on weekends, everybody gets drunk and is rowdy and tells dirty jokes, right?
Yeah.
And then the other half is sort of the Czech majority or dominant class, but they're distant, and they're a little bit hoity-toity.
Yeah. And then you mentioned in one of your emails to me as well, the relationship of the sort of Fred Silverman as a Jew himself, and this weird tension between all these three different immigrant communities, which in the context of America are all on the bottom of the rung as immigrants. And yet there's always that sort of scrambling, and there's still a hierarchical organization that'll manifest, at least in an American context, kind of no matter what scale you head towards.
Exactly. And what's really quite wonderful is that the relationships that would have prevailed in the village, somewhere, wherever it was in Czechoslovakia, still prevail, in this United States outcropping, so that Fred is offered food to bring home to his tanta, but she's strictly kosher, so he can only bring her fruit. And what's really quite wonderful is that in these old immigrant outcroppings, there's complete acceptance of Fred's being a Jew. It's just part of the ongoing story, so that the story is more about the coexistence of the Jews and other groups in Eastern Europe. And after all, the Jews lived in peace and mostly peace and stability in Poland, like for 700 years. And what Avram does with it is he turns the post-war United States into a slightly uncanny afterworld to this sociology. And therefore, on the highest level, what the critical theory part of our course on German fairy tales would have touched is the way that on a very profound level, this story is, with all of its jokes and with all of its realistic settings, this is a profound meditation on memory and time and the transition between generations.
Yeah, there are actually some like little fissures for magic to seep through that I saw, and I wanted to ask you about your catch on them. Some of them are the helpers, like that are classic tropes in fairy tales of the random old person that'll offer their wisdom, and I feel like there were several of those, all of various qualities, all throughout here, and magical artifacts. And I thought it was particularly interesting that the magical artifact of the Slovo Stove itself was able to still operate even when it was broken.
Absolutely. And, the technology is not even that far off. In the 80s and 90s, I had a basement office in Buffalo, New York, and I warmed myself on something that was called a ceramic disc heater. And basically the discs didn't get that hot, and yet the heater produced wonderful heat. So as is typical in science fiction, and one part of Avram is that he is a great speculative science fiction writer, along with Silverman and Heinlein and Asimov, that he actually picked a bit of magic that could exist in the real world. But I love your picking out. Now, you would remember this better than me, but as we get the final explanation late in the story, the black element that was the size of a book, that came from the mountains, and the blue element that was the size of a notebook or something came from the sea, and they were somehow combined. And so that was a fairy tale element. And of course, he keeps going back to the family house. What is the name of the family again? Anyway, we'll get it.
Yeah.
But on one of those trips, there actually is a fairy tale in the story, right? The fairy tale about the king, right, who kept demanding payment for wood, even though, yes, it's the Brock's house, right?
Yeah.
Brock's house, and it's the story of Count Kazmar, who had a monopoly on all the firewood from the forest. And so he ends up forcing people to pay for wood who don't need the wood because they have this peasant technology of the Slovo stove, right, going for them.
Yeah, and it was kind of like another kind of for all the story's humor, it was a little cruel in the ending of that, because it did read as a fairy tale and almost like a moral was on the other side of it, right? That the Slovos would somehow come out the other end able to use their stove and save money for the wood or whatever, do something sneaky and clever. But no, it was just, modern capitalism and extortion, basically, that prevailed in the end. That was just a little bit of a bitter taste that was left in my mouth.
Absolutely. But to continue your thought, Emma, so every fairy tale needs a villain, right? And who is the villain in this story? He is some outcropping of the family whose name is Nick. And he doesn't want anything to do with the past. And he corresponds to a huge portion of the US immigration population, not only of Eastern Europeans and Jews, but Italians and Irish people. And we feel it even in contemporary politics. People who once they're over here, they don't want to hear nothing about the past, even its wonders and its magic, such as the Slovo stove. So from the beginning that we meet this character and father named Nick, he just wants to be an American. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the folkways and the traditions of the Slovos and the Huziks. And in the end, even though his aunt gets such joy and comfort from the Slovo stove, he destroys it, and in such a way that it is gone forever. It turns out that it's the very last operating Slovo stove, and he trashes it to such a degree that its elements won't ever even be known, because there's not one trace of them left.
Yeah, it was tragic, and you're so right. It was such a small thing. And when she's explaining it to Fred in the very beginning, all she can really use it for, she says, is to warm the bottles and make herself a cup of tea, and that's it. And it's still so that a shame is really what it comes down to on behalf of Nick. That's interesting that you paint him as a villain, and I see that he's the manifestation of a greater villain, which is just like, I don't know. I don't want to blame on America or human nature necessarily, but there is some sort of rejection of the outsider or wanting to fit in, at least here. That at least for the first generation or two, there's not so much a celebration of our differences when it comes to this country. It takes us a couple hundred years to get there.
Absolutely, and we're still working on it. And the way race is working out, it is going to take those couple of hundred years until basically there's so much intermarriage that these supposed boundaries of race will just be disappeared, and will just all be beautiful mixed tones, and there won't even be there won't even be a pretense for this racism that exists. But to go back to this world of Parler's Ferry, so somehow these ethnic communities that have displaced themselves, the Slovos, the Huziks, the Jews, but when you read the story, there's a full ethnic catalog of the American populace in town. It's precariously holding on, and they reenact their ceremonies and their rituals, and indeed the way that our hero Jake gets to go into the household, the Brock household in the first place, is a grumzeal, which Davidson deliberately makes very, very arbitrary. It's a remembrance. It's a kind of post-wake scheduled exactly 3 years and 3 months after somebody's death. And then they bring out all of the ethnic treats and they eat all of the food. And somehow this community is holding out. It's persisting, until it's delivered a kind of coup de grace, a definitive blow by Nick. And then at the end of the story, everybody is leaving the town. Someone is going to, the grocer is going to Florida. Nick himself is going to Texas near the border. He'll probably become an absolute terror on the US-Mexican border. And a world has been destroyed. And part of that world is the magic of the stove, but the magic of the stove is not merely this kind of sci-fi invention. The magic of the stove is the ability of literature to create virtual spaces and to enchant us the way you and I are now, Emma, being enchanted by this superb short story.
That is a great point. Is I am just completely enchanted and innocent, just like Fred. And I have this open right here, where I have to ask you, because you talked about memory and people leaving, and I want to talk about memory a little bit with you and the role that memory plays in this short story, where I just remembered not only is it the memory of traditions, there's also like the misremembering of certain things. And it kind of speaks to Avram's just being a good writer beyond just like the bigger morals of the story, or at least, for me, this is a very clever, funny thing. It just makes me laugh every time it happens. He's the great nephew of this Jake Silberman, but he just keeps getting called the grandson and beaten down. And this goes on for pages. And then eventually by the end of the story, he stops saying anything when he's called the grandson of this person. And it's just, to me, I kind of just initially read it as just a funny, clever aspect of that is like necessary of creating the enchanting magical environment that you were talking about, is making it realistic, because that is something that's so realistic that would happen, but it doesn't necessarily need to speak to the larger point of the story. But there might be some profundity, and whether or not it was intentional. I'm curious as to your thoughts on the role of that sort of like that level of mixing up memories.
Thank you so much. That's such a profound point, Emma. And what you're showing is that the putting forward or the maintenance of diasporic populations after they've been transplanted, Davidson is showing in wonderful detail what an inexact science that is, and how there's going to be static and distortion in the transmission as much as there's going to be repetition. And so Jake, the great nephew, becomes the grandson. At several points in the story, characters are introduced, and it's not clear if they're an aunt or a sister.
Right.
And so everything is blurred, but nonetheless, one of the great things about the United States is that it allows itself to be an afterlife, and different peoples with their aspirations and values and different religions can all project a future here, even, as you so well point out, when it's an inexact future.
Wow, that's actually a really great point too. I didn't even, now I can see it as connected to like the ambiguity of everybody's relations to everybody. It's kind of just like, yeah, these are details. Like those details don't quite matter. The main character, Fred, he's just obsessed with the only detail that's really important to him is figuring out the Slovo Stove. And beyond that, his identity, or whether or not this woman was Wes's mother, Wes's aunt, who this old lady was, what their relation is to blah, 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 is kind of just like, what is essential to keeping the things alive? And the thing that's essential by the end of it, it is the Slovo Stove and the story of the Slovo Stove, and not crumbling it because of shame. And that's kind of the tragedy of it. The tragedy of it isn't that we don't know who's who or what's what. It's where do we come from? And it's so interesting as well, like really the land that we come from is the stove itself. It's the land and the water that of the people that it comes from.
Yeah, you raised two really wonderful points that I'll try to take in some sort of arbitrary order. One is the character of Fred, and if you think about Fred, yes, he has an identity. He is the great nephew, and people remember him because his family immigrated to this town along with the Slovos and Huziks. But if you think of narrative, Fred is the incredulous outsider. He comes from outside the frame, and as you would find very often in the work of Franz Kafka, who was also a Czech, and therefore I think that Davidson is definitely making Kafka references. Kafka also has very often in his stories and novels a kind of plant, somebody who is a little bit clueless. And then the structure of the story, Emma, becomes the structure of a detective story, because Jake goes back and forth between the Bronx and various locations in the town. trying to gather data and explanation about the mystery of the Slovo stove. And he's absolutely crushed at the end when he can no longer do this because, as you point out, the evidence has been completely destroyed.
Yes, I want to point this one thing out too. This is one of the most profound aspects to me, because, and you probably remember this about me. I am very curious about humor and the more serious uses of humor. That the joke about the Slovo stove makes the mystery impenetrable for Fred. All he wants to know is how the stove works, and he just can't get past people, Huzzocks, laughing at that joke. And it's just so powerful, and it's so tormenting to be not taken seriously and to keep coming up against it and coming up against it and coming up against it and being deflected and interpreted as if you're joking.
You know, and again, just to give you an obscure reference, I mean, what you just said, Emma, also serves as a splendid plot summary of Kafka's two major novels, The Trial and The Castle. That's exactly what happens to the narrator. But I want to ask you, is it okay if we segue for a moment to the Slovo stove as an achievement of peasant knowledge and craft?
Absolutely.
Well, that's because partly what's written in here, the way that Avram writes up the ethnic makeup and characteristics of the Slovo in particular, they are the peasants, which means that back in the old country, they had developed amazing, all kinds of amazing knowledge and technology in the world of the concrete. It goes back to the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who writes about the science of the concrete, the kind of knowledge that people get through trial and error over the generations. You know, in this field, the peasants are maestros, they're absolute masters. The other person who writes about them in a practice that became called history from the ground up is a French historian named Fernand Braudel. And to Braudel, peasants were a dominant class throughout most of human history. They belonged to the land. They were extremely local, but within those constraints, they developed amazing knowledge and culture. The local grocer, whose name is Matt Grady, is someone who's familiar with culture. He is a highly cultivated man, and yet he inspires only to live in peace in his Slovo community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true with the peasantry and the decontextualizing them. Their intelligence is so based upon the land, and decontextualizing from them, taking them away from that land renders all of their knowledge useless. And so then they seem completely ridiculous. If you just take a side-by-side sort of like bullet point comparison of the things that they can carry with them, we've got the Huzzocks got violins and the Slovos have fiddles, and the Huzzocks have education and the Slovos barely have a little newspaper that just has like the obituaries, and I don't even remember what else it was, but it was just like one front and back. But the fact that they could even produce that newspaper to begin with means that they're beginning to master another person's game as well. So that even speaks more to the sort of I don't want to say intellect because that's not as big of a word as I guess, all encompassing of a word as I'm trying to go for, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Absolutely. The destruction of this precarious immigrant community in the United States is also an allegory of what happened to peasants in the old country with the incursion of modernity. And the Jews in this environment, because back in Europe, in so many places in the Pale of Settlement and beyond, Jews didn't own land. So they ping-ponged back and forth between the landowners and the aristocracy and the people in this story identified as the Huzaks, and the peasantry, but they also related to the peasantry and they served them and they sold things to them as peddlers. And so what Jake is doing here in this uncanny 20th century afterlife of the European old world is he is pursuing, it's not only a mystery story in which he goes everywhere he can to get the goods on the Slovo Stove, but he is reiterating the trajectory of the Jews as they negotiated the sociology of communities in the old world.
Wow. Wow, that's 100% spot on.
Thank you.
And spot on. Wow, I didn't catch that. That's really, really, yeah, it's crucial that he is a Jew because he is this sort of wandering figure, this wandering figure throughout the book, or short story rather.
And at the very end of the story, one of the last characters that he meets, whose name is Pizak, right? And he goes over, Plazek, excuse me, P.D. Plazek.
Okay.
And reiterates what became the standard immigration story of all of these populations. And, I'll just read you a tiny little bit. This is also when Fred is trying to recoup the parts of the Slovo Stove. And so in Petey's words, so the poor Slovo was wearing high boots with his pants tucked in them, and a shirt, smock, and a sheepskin coat, and a fur hat. This was before Ellis Island, Castle Garden in those days. He didn't have a steamer trunk. He didn't have a grip. He only had a sort of a knapsack. So what was in it? A clean smock shirt and some clean foot rags, because they didn't use socks, and a little iron pot and some hardtack bread, type bread, and so forth and so on. And these two stove parts, the black part and the blue part. And I just want to talk about how realistic this is. This is how Eastern Europeans lived. This is what they would have brought to the United States, all the way down to the foot rags. People did not wear socks. It turns out that socks are also a kind of invention, a late invention. And these people just, between themselves and their shoes, they wrapped these long cloths called foot rags. It's just completely realistic. Avram gets it exactly right.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really good to know. He was a Jew himself, and I know he went to war as a medic in World War II. And it's interesting because this piece was published in 1985, but I'm not sure when he wrote it. I'll have to ask about that because, there's a lot of there's so much reality to this, and addition of magic.
There is magic and there is wonder. And, he uses so much craft in the story, so much narrative craft. And if I could talk about that just briefly for a moment. So the mystery of the story is the Slovo Stove, and in different contexts and circumstances, Fred engages with it no less than 5 times in the story, in its wonder, in its inexhaustibility. Benjamin always says that, what the folktale starts out with is a kind of inexhaustible image. But then in between, he goes to these various locations, and Avram is a master at choreographing the development of the plot and the rhythm of being within the kind of magical, enchanting mystery of the stove, and then going outward from it into the surround to get more and more information about what it might mean. And it's just absolutely gorgeous the way he does it. And so, and there's just no question that he belongs to the club of gifted storytellers, and I'm sure you remember that one of Walter Benjamin's most notable and remembered essays is called The Storyteller. And what the storyteller does is, through craft and through an uncanny taste for detail, embellish a long period of time. And so the Slovo Stove becomes an insignia for a full 40 years of these immigrant communities inhabiting Parler's Ferry. And it's done in just such a gifted way. And Fred's wanderings, between the stove and the apartment where it resides and the surrounding environment is a work of storytelling craft that Benjamin would absolutely have revered and admired.
Oh man, I'm so glad you liked it. I feel that way. I feel that way for sure. I have one final question for you.
Sure.
If you could adapt this to another medium, technological medium, it could be film, television series, it could still be a book, it could be a longer novel, a play even. What is the medium that you can see?
I would probably do it both as a play and a film. And I think what drama could do for it is really highlight the stove and its magic and its effect on people. And drama would foreground the main conflict in the story, which is between Nick and the people who just want the culture to hold on just a little bit longer in the tenuous and rapidly changing environment of Parler's Ferry. But then to get away a little bit from the stove and make it a kind of allegory of diaspora and diversity in the United States. And also, the long time frame, the fable of what happens in an American town over the course of 40 years as new demographics and new technologies are brought in, that a gifted filmmaker could do splendidly.
And what genre do you think ultimately it would fall under as a film?
That's a really wonderful question. But I think it would be a drama, oddly enough.
Yeah. I could see it going into drama worlds, or fantasy even. I could see it taking a more like targeted towards children fantasy. And I can see sprinklings of comedy as well, just to make it bearable, help the medicine go down.
Well, Emma, you live in that world more closely than I do. So I think your insights are really well taken there. And I love the idea of doing it for children. I don't think it would quite make sci-fi because, as you were saying before, the magic is really more at the level of the folk tale or the fairy tale. It's not really a kind of elaborated 2001 where there's a complicated alternate universe and you have to follow through a million details to see how it works.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sussman. Thank you. This is so much fun to have this conversation with you.
It was an honor to be here, and thank you so much for resuming our relationship with this beautiful story.
Thank you. All right, bye, listeners.
It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.